Well, today I am really thrilled to be inviting back Miguel Ruiz Jr., who is a philosopher, a writer, an author, a guru. He is amazing, and I've met him in person, and we've had him before on the show, and we even had his dad, Don Miguel Ruiz Sr., who wrote the Four Agreements, and Miguel has just learn from his family. And at the same time, he has really grown tremendously in his own philosophy. Let me tell you a little bit about Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. He is a Nagual, a Toltec master of transformation. He is a direct descendant of the Toltecs of Eagle Knight lineage, and he is the son, as I said, of Don Miguel Sr. And he combines the family traditions and the philosophy and all the knowledge that they had, and also blends it with his own experiences. He's grown and evolved, and especially living in an environment where he's being raised by a grandma and a parents who are also very much into this incredible evolved philosophy. And he now helps others. And I just want to show this wonderful book that I just finished reading. It's called The Mastery of Self, a Toltec Guide to Personal Freedom. And we all want freedom. So I'm really excited about that. And you can find out more about Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. at our website at conflicthealing.com, and also at his website at Miguel Ruiz Jr. Jr.com. So thank you so much for coming back to visit with us. It's
Oh my,
wonderful.
thank you so much for having me on your program again. Once again, it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Well,
And
you're an honor.
you're feeling better.
Yeah, thank you so much. So in this book that I just love, it reminded me so much of what I've been, studying and working on when I do programs on emotional intelligence. But you go further. So let's talk about what is the mastery of self.
For me, is the moment where I no longer pretend to be something I am not and accept myself just the way I am. It is the moment where I am in complete control of my free will, that I'm responsible for my own free will, and that I respect myself to experience the consequences of my own choices. You can say
Mhm.
I am the sum of every decision that I've ever made, but at this very moment, I'm the youngest I will ever be, which means the past of who I was only exists in my memory, and I can't go back in the past and change a yes to a no or no to a yes. The
Yeah.
future doesn't exist, it only exists in my imagination, which is the only place where I truly exist is this very moment. And at this very moment, this is me. It's accepting the whole of who I am. And to me, that's where the mastery of self comes in. I choose what I say yes, what I say no, that my no is just as powerful as my yes, and that life has all the right to say no to me just as much as it has the right to say yes. And I am engaging life in that way.
Right. So, I know you talk about in this book how to get there, but
Mhm.
let's talk about the first step to be able to do that, because I think so many people blame other people, right? They don't have um, a knowledge of accepting responsibility for who they are. They don't live in the present. They either are ruminating about the past
Mhm.
or, worried about the future. It's such a beautiful thing what you talk about in mastering self, because it, like you said, it gives us freedom.
Mhm.
So what is the first step that we have to take?
It's basically a moment of clarity, a moment where we become aware of what we've created. I usually use the analogy of a drunk person or an alcoholic or drug addict that one morning wakes up and sees for the very first time what they've created. At that moment, you have a choice. If you choose to go back in the cycle, you'll take the hair of the dog and have that drink again to take away that hangover, and there you are. Or you make a shift. So a moment of clarity without any action is just a thought that passes in the wind. But a moment of clarity followed by action becomes a pivotal moment in our life. It is the moment where we accept the truth and we let go of the illusion that we've been believing or saying yes to or been wanting to see. So it all starts with that ability or that willingness to see what we have created, and we
Mm,
have a choice. to continue on that path, or we simply change direction.
Miguel, you grew up in, with your dad, and I've heard you talk about your grandma having a lot of wonderful influence on you. So you've had that. You grew up with that, even though maybe, you went through rebellious times as all kids do.
Mhm.
But you know, well, first of all, tell us what it was like growing up with that kind of philosophy from your dad and your family. What was that like?
Well, it was magical, and the reason why it was magical is because I love my grandmother, I love my father, my mother, my grandfather. I love the people in my family who taught me the tradition, and I grew up in juxtapositions continuously. You know, the dualities. For example, my grandmother was a faith healer as well as my grandfather Don Luis, and my father and my uncles were medical doctors. My father a neurosurgeon, my other uncles a neurosurgeon, an oncologist. My mom's a dentist. So you had Western medicine and homeopathic spiritual remedies on the other side. And at the same time, I also lived in San Diego, California, but I commuted every day to go to school in Tijuana. So I was raised in
Mm.
two different worlds. So I grew up in one culture that speaks Spanish, and I grew up in another culture that speaks pure English, and I'm able to function in both. Then I went to school and I grew up in academia. So I learned how to engage with logic and reasoning. And at the same time, I grew up surrounded by spirituality, you know, in different forms, from people who were hippies, who were people who were monks, people who were really into the whole shamanic tradition, and then watching my father evolve. You know, I'm being the oldest. I remember Dr. Miguel Ruiz. I remember Apprentice Miguel Ruiz, and I know Don Miguel Ruiz. I watched my father's transformation. So in my own life, I saw that, and it's helped me navigate my own journey. You know, especially when I let go of the biggest lie I ever told myself, which is I'm a Ruiz. This is automatic. I believe that lie, and it took me to a place where I really corrupted the tradition. You can say I practiced the four conditions as opposed to four agreements. So it's even though I grew up with a family that was very spiritual, I still went through all my stuff, and including I corrupted the family tradition in my own way until I had a moment of clarity and I began to let go. In this case, the analogy is I let go of the four conditions and I started to practice the four agreements.
Now, isn't that really kind of the hero's journey? Don't we always go through that? I think about Siddhartha when I read the book Siddhartha, he had
Yes.
to rebel and then he came to a place. And I think if you would not appreciate it as much had you
Mhm.
not done, engaged in the four conditions instead of the four agreements.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And when you were, in your ego, so to speak, or in those four conditions, what was the response of your grandmother and your dad? How were they just like saying, "He'll go through this"? How
Yeah.
were they?
Then step back because apparently it's a family tradition to rebel against its family tradition. My father went through it, my uncles went through it, my grandmother went through it, my great grandfather Leonardo went through it. I don't know if Don Ezequiel went through it or not, but that's because I only have legends.
Right.
But for example, in my life, my grandma Sarita was always a master. But then again, she was in her 60s when I was born. She passed away when she was 98.
Mm,
And I witnessed my father's youth, and I'm old enough to witness his transformation.
mm,
So, from that point of view, I can only make the assumption that they stepped back and just let me make my mistakes. And actually, it's the way my father parented me. You know, Dr. Miguel Ruiz expected straight A's, and did it. He was definitely a domesticator.
right,
Apprentice Don Miguel Ruiz was learning how to shift that, but he was still, but not so rigid.
right, right.
Don Miguel Ruiz parenting styles was more of a laissez-faire type of thing. Let the experience teach you, because that's how life teaches you, through the consequences of your own actions. And that's when I really learned to really take responsibility for my consequences, to experience, to respect myself, to experience it, because that's the way life teaches us,
Right.
and not to use it to reinforce whatever domestication or conditional love I have for myself, but let it be the instrument that life teaches me through.
Beautiful. I know that you said that, so I heard an interview where you said that, your grandmother had the greatest influence on you.
Mhm,
And I'm questioning how interesting that is in terms of the women in the
mhm,
Toltec tradition.
mhm.
And you said she was a healer. And
Mhm.
so, what, this, as we're going through this whole yin yang and all the stuff that we're going through, and women wanting to be,
Mhm.
um, recognized as an equal partner in whether it's in business or at home.
Mhm.
And so, what is the Toltec tradition about the feminine and the masculine? Do you have any idea? Is that is that a respectable thing that they're equally respected, or what?
Well, yes, in our family, we were a matriarch family. My grandmother, even though she passed away in 2008, she's still the head of the family.
Hmm.
That's how we grew up. The women in our family, what in our we call them caponeras in the family. The head of households.
Right.
The men were all different as well. My grandmother just raised us differently. The whole point of view. She had 13 kids with 64 grandkids.
Wow.
And every single one was different, and everyone was raised differently. And we're all a product of the generation we grew up in.
Right.
Now, in our family, everyone teaches the Toltec tradition as unique as they are. For example, Don Ezequiel, according to the legends, he was born somewhere in 1830s, and according to legend, he lived to be 116 years of age.
Wow.
And I say that because I don't remember what year he was. I know he was 54 years old when Don Leonardo was born, my great grandfather,
Hmm.
and that was in 1882, 1983, something like that. So Don Ezequiel was a carpenter, a handyman, but in his old age, all the legends that I heard of is him. He was the caretaker of a cemetery, and that's where he taught a lot of his apprentices
Wow.
the tradition in life and death, and letting go of the fear of death, of life. Because that's the biggest fear we have. We're not afraid of death; we're afraid of life.
Mm.
His son, Don Leonardo, being born in 1883, he's a product of the Mexico of that age. So he grew up a soldier, but he was also a musician. So as time progressed, he mastered being the band leader, orchestra leader through music and as a musician. And he taught the Toltec tradition as unique from the point of view of discipline as a soldier and the creation of a musician, which is in
Hmm.
contrast to Don Ezequiel, who, from what we heard, he was the trickster, the old school shaman stereotype that we create, that image, that was Don Ezequiel. If I remember that image from the movie, the Milagro Beanfield War, that image of
Mhm.
death that way. Then Don Leonardo's daughter, Madre Sarita, my grandmother, she decided to practice the tradition through faith healing,
Mm.
spiritual work in that way. And she is the one that decided to share the tradition outside of the family. You can say Don Leonardo, Don Ezequiel taught to very few people, because of the taboo of the leftovers of the Holy Inquisition. You don't talk
Right.
outside of the Catholic Church.
Right.
So they taught to a very few people. But my grandma Sarita decided to break that and began to teach it outside the family.
Mm.
And she opened a center in Barrio Logan in San Diego, California, called Nueva Vida back in the early 1970s. And she shared it with the whole community. And you can say that when people ask me if I'm walking in my father's shoes, I have to correct them. No, we're walking in my grandmother's shoes. This is her dream. My father, myself, and my brother Jose Luis,
Oh,
we're just following through on what she started. So
beautiful.
you have my grandmother, then you have my father, who is the product of the 60s and 70s. Then you have me and my brother, who are the products of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And we'll see where my daughter and my son take it. But it's all unique to the individual as we engage the era that we're in, because the people I just mentioned, they practice the Toltec tradition according to the era they
Right.
know.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And that's the beautiful thing. And it's exciting to see that my daughter doesn't have to deal with the taboos that my grandmother had to deal with.
Right.
She gets to create. She's
Mm.
the benefactor of many women, not just my grandmother and the women in my family, but the whole civilization, this whole society of people standing up. She owes so much to Ruth Gainsbourg, and all the women of that generation, and even as I'm thinking of that movie, about her, her daughter is the one that made her realize that she can go beyond that. Her daughter, and how she answered those men in the street, and she goes, "When I growing up, I couldn't just do that. Well, now we're the '60s, we can do it, or '70s."
Yeah, right.
So it's impressive to even witness that. I'm quoting a movie, of course, about her life, the RGB, but just watching the new generations and seeing what they're able to do. And I watched my daughter; she's 13 years old, and wow, and my son
Yeah.
as well. And my son has autism; he has his own journey.
Yeah.
But in our life, in our society, in our family, we have the labels that society projects onto us, and it's a question of us to engage them, to change it, or to move the story forward. So I come from a family whose head of the family was a woman, and who decided to move the story forward.
That's beautiful. At the time that she did this, I want to just repeat and show everybody who's watching or listening that we are talking with Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. And this is his wonderful book, The Mastery of Self: A Toltec Guide to Personal Freedom. Now, in your book, you talk about domestication and attachment. And you had a previous book, The Five Levels of Attachment. So that seems to be the biggest challenge for us, right? These attachments. Talk a little bit about that, the difference, the difference between domestication and attachment, and how
Mhm.
it really holds us back.
Sure. Well, just to start with, um, domestication is a system of reward and punishment by which we model the behavior of an individual, where if we live up to the expectation, we're worthy of the reward. And if we fall short of that expectation, we're worthy of the punishment. Since
Right.
we are emotional beings who experience life through the spectrum of our emotions, the full spectrum, that reward, when we live up to expectation, feels like acceptance, which feels
Oh,
like love. And the punishment, when we fail to live up to expectation, feels like rejection, which means it's the lack thereof love. It's the way we've
right.
learned conditional love.
Right.
And attachment is to make something that's not a part of us by investing of ourselves emotionally, energetically, or intellectually onto something. It's we make that a part of who we are. Now,
That could be like our career,
mhm,
our spouse, our kids,
yes,
whatever it is that is outside of ourselves that we align with, right?
yes. Here's the thing: an attachment is healthy. It's actually something that we do naturally. It's like it's an actual
Yeah.
thing to be able to say it's good to have an attachment. What makes it unhealthy is this: when the time comes to let go, to detach, we
Right.
can't. And it's kind of like holding on to something that no longer exists. So you see, imagine an attachment in life. It's just to engage a moment, and when the moment is over, you disengage. Imagine a flower. Let's imagine a lotus flower. A lotus flower engages a moment, which closes itself, and when the moment is over, it's able to open up again. So imagine that flower pulsating with engaging, disengaging, engaging, disengaging, attach, detach, attach, detach. In New York City or in Los Angeles, that flower is constantly engaging everything. And here in Reno may not be as fast. And if you go to a small community somewhere in the Midwest, it's going a little bit slower because life is just in that tempo. But when the time comes to let go, we're able to let go.
It
But
reminds me of, the Buddha says, all suffering comes from not accepting what is.
mm-hmm, yep,
So that's kind of a similar philosophy that, that when I'm in this relationship, if it ends,
mm-hmm,
then I accept it
yes,
and know that that's part of life, or whether I'm sick or whatever it is.
yes,
It's not easy. If
mm-hmm,
you and I were talking before the show started with loved ones that have passed from COVID or whatever,
yes,
is that we are heartfelt, and we have to let go of
mm-hmm.
that. It's not easy to do.
No. And that's the thing is that some people think, well, no, in order to love someone, you have to attach yourself. But no, I only control to the tips of my fingers. You control to the tips of yours. Everyone in my life is in relationship with me because they said yes. Every relationship only exists for as long as those two people say yes. But at any given moment, that yes can change it to a no. The relationship ceases to exist. So the thing about and not being able to detach is that all of a sudden we're only able to stay in our attention in at time where we both said yes, and that was a long time ago. Like the image I have is of Napoleon Dynamite's Uncle Rico, who's still holding on to his glory days in high school when he was a quarterback, when everyone loved him,
Right.
and a lot of times have passed, and he's already in his 30s or 40s, whatever, however old uh, Uncle Rico is, but he's living in the past. He's
Right.
trying, even tries to play with this time machine that the kids bought, thinking take me back to 1984 because that was the last year I felt accepted.
Oh.
But
Mhm.
a lot of us have that with relationships, with being in high school or in college or the previous work or even January 2000. You know, life was completely different in January of 2000, but now
Right.
it's dramatically different, and we adapt. If
Right.
we're not able to adapt, that's where because we're still holding on to a life that doesn't exist. So
Right.
it's not about an attachment to an object. It's about an attachment to a belief, an idea, which is a lot more difficult to detach from. In fact, we don't get attached to objects. We get attached to the meaning of the object. What
Right.
does that mean to us?
Right. Like if you have to move, I remember when we sold our big home because the kids had grown, and
Hmm.
it was hard for me. It
Hmm.
it it, it meant family, it
Hmm.
meant fun, it meant all these happy things. And yeah, it was an disenchant attachment, or it was an unattachment. And I'm
Yes.
trying to think how I even did it. I think what I did was say to myself, what is the beauty that's coming from
Hmm.
this? What, that one door closes, another door opens. And I
Yeah.
had to really convince myself that
Hmm.
it's okay, that I
Hmm.
gotta I let the past go, have wonderful memories, and I step to my future. But it wasn't easy, Miguel.
Especially when we use uh, we identify ourselves with that moment in time, and that's the way
Yeah.
we do attach ourselves to something. We make that the way we attach ourselves to ideas, to concepts, to moments is by identifying ourselves with it. And the slippery slope and how it relates to domestication is that we use that image of identity like a mask,
Right.
like a model by which we domesticate ourselves. If we live ourselves to that expectation, we're worthy of love. And if we don't, we're worthy of the rejection.
Right.
So, who am I without my identity? Who am I with this belief of who I am? And that's one of the reasons why it's so tough to let go of a house where our kids grew up. You know, my house right here, right now, has all the lines of how they grew up. You know, I have those
Right.
that
Right.
wall.
Their
I may have
heights.
to
Right.
cut
We
off
did that.
that.
Yeah.
I may have to cut off that piece of the wall and take it with me. But the thing about it is that
Right.
it's what's more important,
Yeah.
the living being that is still with me, my son and daughter, or that
Right.
wall, and
Right.
my son and daughter. And who
Right.
are they? They're no longer those kids whom I marked with time. They're the individuals who are now. And if I don't pay attention to that, I'm gonna miss it.
Right.
So it is the
And that
thing.
goes back to living in the present that you were talking about.
Mhm.
To be in this very present, which there's so many people that I see around me, and especially because my job is being a mediator, and I'm an attorney mediator with people in conflict all the time,
Mhm.
and they're attached to this conflict as well,
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
and they don't see that. And I love that you have a section in one of your chapters about conflict. And I love what you said because you kind of welcome that conflict. Just like I say, it's a gift, it's in disguise, because if you use it to grow and evolve, it's great.
Mhm.
We don't have a lot of time, but could you talk a little bit about that now, about conflict, why you welcome it?
Well, in conflict, it's a life. stories moves with a little bit of resistance.
Mm,
And if you are so attached to a belief, you can go into that conflict completely blind, and you're not going to stop until you think you're won, and only because you won't stop until you really want, because you can only live with yourself if you win. That's
right,
domestication. At that point, it blinds you. It blinds you what's in front of you.
right.
But one of the things about conflict is that it actually shows you when life has changed,
Or it
and
needs to change, right?
it needs to change. But yeah, I mean, it's like, for example, as I remember sitting at the edge of a playground crying, and my father came up to me, "Why are you crying?" Because I told him I don't fit in this playground anymore. I'm too big. It was an interior conflict, not a conflict with other people, but in myself. And you get to the point where you finally surrender to the truth, which sometimes is heartbreaking because I don't get to experience that ever again.
Right.
But as soon as I was able to let go of that, a whole new playground changed, because it's what I'm playing. It's a game. It was what now with my friends, my then girlfriend, and things like that. Everything changed. But in that conflict, the ability to have two people share with one another, this is what I want, this is what I want. If you're able to listen to one another, you are able to create a whole new culture. But
Exactly.
if you let domestication rule this conflict, then you have a battle of imposing and subjugation, and you won't stop until the other side's subjugated. But then there's a lack of respect, and it's just a battle of who is going to domesticate who. But the moment you just take a step back and you see why you're doing this, you have a choice. Either you continue, you find the medium ground, or you simply walk away.
And let go. And that,
Otherwise,
yeah. And
story.
we are, believe it or not, we're out of time. I just
Yep.
can't believe it. I just want to make sure that we say the name of your book again. This wonderful book. It's called The Mastery of Self, Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. And you can go to Miguel Ruiz Jr.com. And also, it is a wonderful Toltec guide to
Mm,
personal freedom. And when we really be who we are, and we accept that and we live in the present, oh my gosh, it's a lot of freedom. So it's something that we can work on our entire lives. I love this book. I love you, Miguel. You're wonderful.
thank
Thank
you
you
so much.
so much. We look forward to your next book. And so just give your website again, and it's time to go.
Uh, MiguelRuizJr.com. That's MiguelRuizJR.com. And thank you so much for this opportunity, and hope you have a lot of fun. And I'm glad that you're feeling so much better. You and your
Thank-
husband are both feeling so
Yes.
much better.
Thank you.